In a secluded facility on a remote island, a group of prisoners has signed away their rights to be experimented on by Dr. Steve, a researcher and scientist who tests new drugs that can stimulate and intensify different emotions in human beings. Sometimes they might not even know what the drugs are or what effects they might have. Dr. Steve seeks to unlock the potential of human emotions and their potential to be manipulated for various purposes. To do so, a device is installed on the prisoner's lower spine, which contains some little containers of drugs that are administered with their permission. Of course, there are a lot of prisoners, but the main character that we follow during the movie is Jeff. At the beginning of the movie, we see that he is taken to a polluted and smoky part of the island and is administered a drug called M4D, which actually stimulates love. When you are administered this drug, you see everything beautifully. Then another drug is released into his system that is called Verbalist, which makes people express what they think freely and verbally. When he gets these two drugs, he starts describing the ugly landscape as very beautiful. In a flashback scene, we see Jeff at a party where he kisses his girlfriend goodbye and leaves with his friend. However, while driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs, he drives very fast and carelessly, which leads to an accident in which his friend is killed. The next day, Jeff and Heather, both prisoners, are called to a testing room to receive the drug M4D. Before they were given the drug, they did not know each other or find each other attractive. However, after receiving the drug, they begin to like each other and eventually make love. Dr. Steve is pleased with the results and reveals to his assistant Mark that his main goal with the experiment is to create an elixir for love that will prevent people from loneliness. For his experiment to accomplish, he needs to follow them to see if they will develop any feelings for each other even when they are not under the influence of the drug. Of course, there is no difference in their behavior before and after the experiment. However, Jeff gets close to another girl called Lizzie. Some days later, they bring Jeff to the experiment room with another woman called Sarah, who isn't as attractive as Heather. Despite being older and not very attractive, after being injected with M4D, they too make love. The next day, Steve calls Jeff into the control room and puts Sarah and Heather in the test room. He asks Jeff to choose one of them to get a drug called Darkenflux. Apparently, this drug brings the darkest side of people out and makes them feel pain, sadness, regret, or other negative feelings much more than usual. Jeff, who has some experience with this drug, resists and chooses neither of them to take that drug. The next day, they call him to the test room with a scary big guy called Robin. He thinks that they want to inject them with the M4D and make them make love. He gets mad and rushes into the control room and sees Heather there. Then, Heather explains that they represented her with the dilemma of choosing one person to get the Darkenflux. So he realizes that they made Heather and Robin have sex too. Steve explains that they give these kinds of tests to everybody because that's what the protocol committee had decided, and he has no say in this. Some days later, Jeff is again called into the control room, and this time Steve tells him that he has talked to the protocol committee and they said that Jeff must administer Darkenflux to someone. They have Heather in the test room and Jeff is obliged to administer Darkenflux to her. The effect of this drug is so irresistible that Heather breaks everything and cuts her throat with a piece of broken wood. While Jeff and Mark go to the test room to see what has happened to her, Jeff opens the drawer and finds Steve's notebook. By reading his notebook, Jeff realizes that there is no protocol committee and Steve is doing all these experiments for his personal pharmaceutical company. He has a list of drugs for specific purposes. The last one of them is B6. Jeff puts the notebook back before Steve arrives to the room. Steve then justifies Heather's death to be for the best cause, which is to find love and peace in the world by testing drugs such as M4D that intensifies love in people. In the meantime, Jeff and Lizzie get closer. He talks to her about his experience in the control room and the feeling of guilt. He tells her about the night of the accident, and once more we go back in his memory, but this time there is a difference. We see that he not only killed his friend, but also his girlfriend was in the car and she too lost her life. After confessing the darkest moment in his life, they make love. Little by little, Steve realizes that Jeff has feelings for Lizzie, and of course he wants to take advantage of this for his experimental purposes. So the next day he calls Jeff to the control room again, and this time puts Lizzie in the test room and wants Jeff to administer Darkenflux to her. He refuses to do so and gets mad, but Steve tells him to go to his room and sleep on it and come back the next day. That night, when Mark, Steve's assistants, go to Jeff's room to recharge the container on his spine, Jeff tells him that he knows everything about their project. He knows that there is no protocol committee and that Steve is doing it all for his own benefits, and especially the main drug that he is aiming to test and produce is not N4D but a drug called B6. Mark says that he thought Steve was a genius who wanted to change the world for the better, but now that he sees Steve is crossing the line, he regrets working for him, so they make a plan. The next day, when Jeff goes to the control room, we see that Mark is not there. In order to convince Jeff to use the Darkenflux on Lizzie, Steve tells him that this is the last experiment with this drug and he has thrown the rest away. When Jeff gets the control of the device, he gets control of the drugs in Steve's container and starts administering different drugs into his system. And then we realize the plan. Mark emptied Jeff's pack and filled Steve's with all the drugs he was testing, including Darkenflux, and then he went out to report the project to the police. Under the influence of various drugs, including Verbalist that makes you talk, Steve confesses that the main drug he planned to test and produce was B6, which is actually a drug that makes people become obedient and do whatever their masters want them to do. He also confesses that Jeff and Lizzie have served their time and they have been free for some time, but he didn't tell them and kept them there illegally because they were his best test subjects. At the end of the movie, when the police is coming to arrest him, he runs away, gets on his private plane, but because of different drugs in his system, he loses control and has an accident. Jeff and Lizzie get on a boat and go out of the island.